Hey, Abby.
Hello, hello.
So it's just you and me today.
Yeah, I got on
Oh,
as quick as I could because we were running over on the other one. So just in case somebody who wasn't on the other one was on this one, but still a few minutes behind. So we'll see what happens.
this is going to be David, you and me, perhaps. That's it.
And we may not need the full hour, or we may use it for something else. Like, not too stressed. We will see what happens. How are you doing?
Bit tired. I'm on the train back home after 2 days at a client with a platform engineering workshop.
Ah, high energy then. Lots of or energy, high energy draw, I should say,
Oh,
on you
yes.
probably. So
They're actually good. Like, introduced them to the maturity model and everything. So they actually
nice.
had some interesting angles on it.
Anything
Pretty
that
good.
is worth sharing, or you need to stew on it
Um,
a little bit more before you do?
no, it's fine. Like, talk to them about like figuring out where you are on the platform maturity journey, and they actually wanted to use the maturity model in relations to different teams they're talking to. Sort of like
Mm,
assessing one area might be like, as I said, like we can assess them and say they're at a level one, but we want to like pull them all the way up to level three where we're at. Like, what should we do to like raise that area's level? Because they're sort of more like, where are they? How can we measure them, and how can we figure out how we can raise them to the level of our overall platform offering?
yep. Yeah.
So sort of a working document.
Cool. Yeah.
They figure
That's
out they need to do a ton of marketing about their platform because nobody knows it's there, but everybody's happy.
yep. Marketing is always the thing.
Yes.
Cool. And do you feel like the assessment is being used in a uh like helpful way to guide that improvements, or do you think that it's not effective kind of being used in that way across like many teams across the organization kind of thing, split across the teams and all
Uh,
that?
I actually think it was pretty good for it. The only
Nice.
thing they actually noticed was that our level two seems to have a negative tone to it, or
Ooh,
could be read as a negative tone.
interesting. Which so that is the uh let me see. Because that was something that we definitely, I mean, look, it's hard. These are long pieces of work, but that was something we were trying not to have happen. So that's the operational level has a somewhat negative they were feeling it had a somewhat negative connotation to it, hey?
Sorry, just took a scan. What do you
No
say, Abby?
worries. I said was it the operational level that they felt like it had a slightly negative connotation to it.
Yes.
Operational.
I
Interesting.
guess the city,
Okay.
like, it's not directly negative, but it's more like you feel in a negative setting when you read it.
Interesting. I'm always interested, like that's really good feedback 'cause I'm always interested on like how much of it is if you aren't happy with where you are, if you read the facts of where you are negatively, or if they do have a negative sort of tilt because there's biases in how we were writing it and that kind of thing, right? So it's a really interesting thing just to like do a fresh set of eyes read through and be like, all right, where is those little nudges towards sort of a bias or a feeling about it? So that's really cool. Interesting. Thank you.
It might be a bias because they were probably at a high level in some of the points, so they saw it more as a negative thing that you would be
Exactly.
stupid if you were there.
I think I find it really interesting, right? Because it's like there's bias in the writing, and that's what I'm saying we have to sort of root out. Like, where did we have bias when we were writing it that created sort of a tone to it or whatever? There's also bias in reading, right? There's bias everywhere, and it's always interesting to see
Mhm.
like if the state you're in when you read changes your tone or your read of it, right? So it's very interesting. Cool. Uh, Awesome. Well, we are here. We are almost 10 minutes past the hour. And what do we want to use today for? I think the
That's a great
goal was
point.
operations, but
We're missing a lot of folks.
Mhm.
And I think we didn't have a lot of content if I was reading Slack correctly.
I see three questions in there right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I jolted them in this morning.
Cool.
Yeah, it feels like there are things we could do, but given that we've tried to make these meetings about working together, I think working together with fewer people would seem to generate some FOMO and needing to redo and revisit some things. So Zara, I think there are lots of still not content or not quite same as the content stuff we've been doing. Um, one thing I did think of is if we want to, we could just co-generate the content. Because that's equivalent to the asynchronous stuff.
Hey, see, we have blocked calendars. We can use it.
Yeah. Or we can take the time back, if people need it.
I agree with you on the risk of sort of doubling back on things. I have a question that I'd love to see if people feel like it's worth us discussing in a larger setting or here, which is we've talked about these sets of conversations as sort of alignment generating, content generating kind of things, and that we're going to have to come through with sort of a more stable voice to create a draft off the back of all this content that then can be kind of properly dug into as kind of a complete option, right? And reviewed and all of that. The one thing I was thinking about with that is we're tackling this kind of aspect by aspect, right? We're going over investment and then adoption, and now we're going into operations and so on. Do you all see an intention of that being in the long term how we do the questions? Like, do you see like a single question relating to a single aspect, or is there sort of an alignment across aspects that you think we would end up with as we are doing questions? Now that we're gotten through a few aspects, where's your thinking on that?
I think we need. So one of the ideas I'd had is we keep having this discussion. Oh, this belongs here, or this belongs there.
Right.
This feels more like that. I think there is a lot of overlap. So I do think we could end up with a smaller number of questions. One thing that I never even thought of, we talked about yes, no, but what about Likert scale? And just being really straightforward about the sections and questions, but making them Likert oriented and, maybe approaching it that way. But I think the questions themselves, I think we're going to have overlap as to how it's presented. I guess we'll need to figure that out, right? Like if we're going to try and make a self-assessment that doesn't map clearly. And like, I think one of the risks of that is people not quite understanding how they landed and why they landed where they did, right? If they're doing it by themselves and we have some tool or whatever that takes a single page of consolidated questions and gives them an answer. Because in the end, we want to tell them exactly why they are at a particular coordinate in the model and how to move on. So that to me says I'd rather have duplication in the questions than try to consolidate, because they should be able to go and look at a coordinate and say, I want to move, I think this is important to move up from. And if our questions are smart and try to, try and make it look, I don't know. I don't know what the value is of consolidating like that, because especially in a self-assessment, if you're not doing a self-assessment, if you're doing it as an interviewer and a consultant, and you want to remain a little like we do with the interview, which is not quite assessment, but we're not trying to lead people on a particular path, right? So the insights we get out of the interviews are potentially different and generative, right? Whereas this is much more goal oriented.
So maybe
Sorry
I
for
have
the
a
roundabout way of answering that.
yeah, so maybe I have a clarifying question, maybe a couple comments too. So were you saying, Abby, like that the survey or the list of questions at the very end isn't organized by category? Or were you saying it's fine if they're organized by category, but do we feel like they connect like an overall story around platform engineering, like more broadly, I guess?
Yeah, so I think there's probably two of those, like probably a bit of both. So in the sense that right now we're talking about, hey, we're going to have 5 to 10 questions for that connect directly to each aspect. And then we can make a decision once we have those questions of do we go first 5, second 5, third 5, or do we kind of like mix and mash, even if we know that question 1 and 7 and 12 are for adoption and 2 and 6 and whatever are for operations and whatever. Like the questions map to a specific aspect, but they're kind of intermingled, or they can be sort of in bunches. The other side of that though is one question, should one question always map to a single aspect, or can one question result in like that like larger picture of platform engineering where we say like this is if you are if this if your answer for this question lands you in a operational state for your platform, you may get recommendations across a few aspects to look at, depending on other questions that you have also answered, which would indicate that, let's say this question relates to both adoption and interfaces, just picking things out of the blue. You might
Yeah.
say, well, okay, you landed as operational on this question. When we look at the rest of your questions all pulled together, adoption looks to be a weaker category, like more operational versus interfaces looks to be more scalable. Therefore, pulling all this together, we're going to recommend progress in the adoption aspect because blah, right? So I don't know.
Yeah, so I think so based on my experience, I guess I would say two things. So one is that I think it helps to organize the questions by category because then the audience kind of knows what we're talking about, right? And so I always sort of refer back to the matrix, and that there's like in the matrix, there's like a top level sort of description of, hey, this category is talking about this. And so I always kind of ground back to that. And I think last time when we were talking about operations, I was saying operations isn't like what I would typically think of operations in the sense of reliability and scalability and resiliency. It's about how you operate as a platform engineering team, right? And so going back to that sort of definition and then going through the questions helps kind of ground that conversation, right? And I think that there's naturally overlap between the categories. And so I think there will be questions, and I think we've faced this already several times, is, you know, sometimes the question could be about investment, but it's really about something else, adoption or, operations, right? So I think that that's fine. Like, I think that there's going to be natural overlap, and, I guess I always kind of come back to this same concept in my mind about what I'm using this for today, and, what I hope we use it for in the future, which is it's not gonna provide like, all these deep insights or whatever. It's gonna give you at a high level, those 2 or 3 categories where, hey, like you should spend a little bit more time in this area potentially, right? If that's aligned to your budget or your strategy or your, goals as an organization, right? Like it's always predicated on like those things,
Yeah. Cool.
And then I think the other thing that you talked about, David, was about the Likert scale. I think Abby like proposed that pretty early on when we were talking about whether we should use like the yes no format.
I then hid under a table quite quickly.
Really?
Well,
I went and found
like,
I went and found the
Likerts?
channel. I will I'll forward it to you. There was some feedback around it. Yeah. No, I mean it wasn't
I
that bad
think
to be fair, but
I think that, yeah, I mean, I think like we've kind of, so we kind of swung the pendulum to the other side, right? Which is
Mhm.
pretty natural in these kind of scenarios, which is the very simplest format was yes, no. And it creates challenges, right? Because, the question has to be very focused on like one simple topic potentially, where there could be multiple answers, right? So we need this notion of multiple choice or a scale or whatever, right? So we went from that very simple yes/no format to, hey, we have to build in a lot of complexity in the answers and try to figure out how those answers are discrete, how are they mutually exclusive, right? Like, how do they describe each level of maturity, right? So it becomes a lot more difficult to come up with a question and then the resulting answers that fit those criteria. So it's a lot harder to do. The thing about the Likert scale is when people answer the questions, it opens up like a lot more sort of, I think, ambiguity, or maybe like people are like, well, I don't really know, you know. That was one of the experiences I had with the yes no format. Is there were times where the group was like in undecided, right? We're a little bit of this, we're a little bit of that, right? I don't really know. It's like, where are you leaning? Are you leaning towards yes? Are you leaning towards no? It doesn't matter either way, right? And a lot of those, when I'm doing the interview, I would just kind of mark with an asterisk. Hey, there was some discussion about this particular one. It wasn't clearly yes and it wasn't clearly no. There was some dissension. It's one that we probably want to come back to at some point. But what happened was, at the end of it, you'll figure out that there's 2 or 3 things that kind of rise above the cream, which are the top ones that you want to focus on. And those ones that there was like some gray area or whatever become really less important, right? Unless there isn't really that really good sort of cream stuff at the top, you might go back to those ones that are a little bit gray and say, okay, well, let's just dig a little deeper on these ones, because this seems to be an area where maybe there's some opportunity, right?
And Likert seems like it also is better for really subjective stuff, which is where it often gets used, right? Your experience in some process, or what your lived experience is versus like some semi-objective view of what you're doing, right? Because
Yeah.
ideally the self-assessment or any kind of assessment would be as observational as possible, right? And not necessarily self-reported, because anything self-reported tends to be skewed. So um yeah, I can see that. I mean, like I said, but it was just funny that I guess it was a discussion I hadn't, I missed a couple of these at the beginning, and
Yeah.
until the wonderful new calendar system was up. Um, and yeah, the other thing I'd say is we maybe need to keep an eye towards as we get through the content, the outcome that we want people to have, and therefore the output, which should be the input to the next process they go through, which is,
Yeah.
okay, we've scored you, and it's colored, or it makes it obvious what they should work on, and then how do they work on it. And so if it's a little easier in some ways if you have multiple questions that can contribute weighting towards a given score, a given point on the table. But then there should almost be like an answer key type thing. Like, it shouldn't be, I mean, I don't think it's fair to say from this answer, you should be proceeding from answer B to answer C, right? Or something like that. It should go into more depth, like essentially like the maturity model does, right? And it might mean that we get the missing gap in the maturity model, which is like, how do teams actually progress from one stage to the next?
I
Yeah,
think that
so on this one, like the way that I was thinking about it originally is, and sort of the effect of having done this is kind of like, generally what I end up doing is making a proposal, right? And so the proposal would be, here's the 2 or 3 things that um resulted from the assessment, and like, here's the top pieces that you have opportunity around, right? And then going back to, priorities and goals and stuff of the organization. um And so what I think is that it's gonna drive eventually, right? It's gonna drive like a few things, right? It could be a content strategy. So this morning we were talking about, content, right? Like if, for example, if I don't have like a methodology around KPIs, which is a very common challenge that people have, um, how do I do that? How do I create a practice around that, right? What sort of KPIs should I be? What frameworks are out there? What sort of methodology do I need to have? How do I operationalize that, right? Um, and so if that's a gap in my platform engineering strategy, like I need that guidance, right? And so then we need an artifact or some, guidance that we can share to people and say, hey, this is the approach, right? This is sort of the way that the industry looks at this thing, right? And it could be practices, it could be new content, it could be pointing to existing tools like, Dora and Space and other things that are out there, right? It could be that we need like a new project or technology or something, right? So I think it opens up a lot of opportunities from a community standpoint. Um, but that's sort of the intent, right? So I think to me, there's two steps that we have to go through to finish this, right? One is continue to kind of drive the content generation part of it. Then there's going to be like what I believe would be more of a rationalization stage. So we need to kind of rationalize those questions and get to like a small number of questions that kind of to what extent we believe covers the category well. And then there's like the scoring methodology and like trying to figure out how do we how do we take the output of the questions and land them along the spectrum, right?
And I do think that second and third, so I completely agree. And that rationalization is a good way of summarizing what I keep stumbling around to try and say, like, look, there's going to have to be a small group of people that are going to have to put together a draft based on all of these inputs. And it has to be people who've been involved in a vast majority of these conversations so that we can understand the essence of what we've talked about on these calls, because it's going to have to like sort of massage in. So I think that's the rationalization spot you're talking about. I think that's very good. I do think while the scoring mechanism is independent of that, I don't think it can be done without some level of collaboration between the two. Like, I think that when creating those questions, understanding how they're going to get used is going to affect their phrasing to a certain extent. So we can not finalize how we would do scoring and absolutely not worry about what we will do with the scores once they're produced, but sort of having that idea. And I do think I've heard a more kind of, I think we're coming around to the idea that it's going to be almost like a hot spotting on the model. Like, hey, this is pretty clearly where you live, and this other thing is pretty clearly where you live, and this thing seems like it's probably going to be providing more pain, risk, whatever word it is. So therefore, focusing on that. And I think that's sort of what a lot of people are saying that in different ways, right? So I think that's settling. Okay, yeah, I think
Yeah.
that makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, on the scoring part, like I think there's probably I don't think we've spent any time on that quite yet, and
Not
maybe
really.
we have to do that before the rationalization piece, to your point, Abby. Like I think one of the things that I've realized in doing this so far is, well, for one thing, I wasn't mapping necessarily directly to a maturity level. So it was kind of easy for me to kind of escape that because I could just say, hey, well, there's a couple like high level things that I think are really important, right? And
Sticking out, yeah, that are
let's
sticking out,
focus
yeah.
on those, right? Um, but there was but I think there may be something that we have to talk about or consider is there a weighting, right?
Yep.
And I think that once we have the um, rough estimate of the content, it'll help us understand like, do we need a weighting, right?
Yep.
Because that's a whole nother dimension and another like pretty challenging thing to like do in general.
Pop into it, yeah. No,
I
for sure. And I think
go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think that there's a world where we have sort of a few more generic questions that don't map to a specific aspect, but help us sort of ground the general maturity level of the platform, which are backed by specific aspect ones that help us identify which of the aspects might be driving that sort of overarching outcome, and therefore where we could potentially provide feedback. But David liked that so much that he ran away from me. I talked over him, and,
He
and
scared
he's
him off.
given up on me. Yeah, he's given up on me so quickly. But yeah.
He's
Good.
back.
I'm glad I didn't fully scare him away.
No, it's one of our neighbors bringing some mail that just got sort of dumped in the basement. Of
No
course, it does
worries.
say BSE on it. No, what I was gonna say is, in terms of the scoring, when I made the sheet originally, I had sort of a very generic, each question contributes a weighted score to the entire um, section, right? So you had a tab per section, weighted score per section. And one of the problems I think that I'm seeing with that is that, we're saying, oh, this question only really applies to level 2 and 3, or it applies in multiple places. And so, in discussing it now, it almost feels like the weighting should be more specific, and, it should be targeted at levels. And so, a question might only be able to discriminate between levels 1 and 2, and therefore the weighting almost needs to go, for a particular section, it should be, are you more heavily weighted in 1 through 4, not a band of, if you score this way, you get higher. Because you could, in certain aspects of a given level, you might score really high, but that's not enough to like bring you up. And with that kind of granularity, we could have the outcomes and recommendations be more pointed. Like, just because we said you're at level 2 doesn't mean some of your practices aren't at level 3 or 4. And therefore, we shouldn't tell you very blandly, go and do all of these things, right? So I think, that's something we can come back to, and maybe get William to, I don't know if the app stuff has been happening at all in the background. Probably not, right? Given people's time. So, but what I'm saying though is it exceeds my capabilities as an Excel programmer, for sure.
Yeah, I think we'll
I
figure
mean,
out the
I have definitely seen where somebody is like shows up as like super mature in a category, but then they have like a couple things that are like really important that they should still consider, right? So
Mhm.
I think it's going to come like both ways from that perspective. They're going to show up low, but they have like some really good like high-end practices that are, in a much more mature state. Um so it's yeah, it's going to be a mix, but I think we need to explore that part like once we get these drafts together.
cool. We talked about not wanting to go into too much stuff just out of like trying to make progress as the larger group, and that we don't actually have that much stuff to go through on operations. Is there anything else that makes sense to talk about today before we sort of wrap up for the day and come back after the new year?
Yes, Abby, I think drafted a blog for the Platform Engineering Day, NA. So there are some field where I need input. So I actually added all the talks that I've done and asked, and the one portion where what are some of the things discussed in the platform working group booth. So some need few help from some of the people so we have something we can publish it before the end of the year.
Awesome. Yeah, so that is not really the focus of this group. I think there'd be some people on here that might be able to help, but that sounds like a really good thing to put into Slack, because I think that you'll get the right people asynchronously to help you out. So specifically, if you can call out the specific asks that you have. So like obviously you'll want a general review. That's cool. But when people see general stuff, they often don't think they're associated. So also adding in just like, here are the gaps I think I have, or here are the human, the piece of information I'm hoping people can help me with. Someone might see that and feel more compelled to reply and help, because they might feel like that's something they can help with. So, yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much for getting that drafted. I know it's a lot of work, but I was looking for a video from KubeCon Paris, and the only way I found it was by going to that blog. So I was like, that made me think, hey, this is high value. Like, people can find this information and get there. So really appreciate that.
Gesundheit.
Thank you.
Cool. Anything else on the assessment that makes sense for today? Before I think Stefan is into train territory right now. So Corbin, David, or Saeem, anything
No,
on
I
the
think we
assessment?
just need to give folks a little time to recover. Like, I
Yeah.
think, yeah, I mean, even my guess is we're gonna have kind of a similar meeting the first week back, because everyone's gonna be still sort of recovering from recovery. But but we
I,
can try and see what it is. But yeah.
Yeah, I encourage anyone in here to prompt throughout as well, right? So I think that with New Year's being a Wednesday, New Year's Eve being no, New Year's Day being a Wednesday, many people will be back to work Thursday, Friday, but not everybody. And so I think, prompting at some point after the first, you might find that some people have some headspace to do things and will have forgotten all about this, but with a prompt might jump back on and add some questions and whatnot. So please, yeah, feel empowered to prompt and encourage and whatever as you go. Absolutely. So
Are we back on the 7th? When is the
I
next?
believe we're back on the 7th. Yeah. So I've canceled because
Okay.
the next 2 Tuesdays are Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve. So I canceled those 2, but we'll be back on the 7th. So yeah. Which
Perfect.
feels like miles away from the holidays, but I know for one, I'm taking the second and the third off for holiday. So for me, it'll only be my second day back to work, and so I'm sure there'll be many others in that category as well. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it was good to see you all, and I hope you
Yeah.
have a great holiday season. And
Yeah.
And
Have a great holiday.
yeah, thanks all. Appreciate it.
all right, cheers. We'll see you
Bye-bye.
on the 7th.
Bye all. I'm looking forward to that article, Saeem. Thanks again.